In the autumn of 1347, a series of events began that would fundamentally alter the course of European history. What followed was not merely an epidemic, but a catastrophe of such magnitude that it would reshape civilization itself. This is the story of the Black Death. The year 1348 marked a turning point. In London, parish records show that nearly half the population perished within months. Florence's chroniclers documented scenes of mass graves dug in haste, unable to keep pace with the dead. In Paris, daily mortality reached hundreds, and the cries of bereaved mothers echoed through the stones of Notre Dame. The catalyst for this devastation arrived by sea. October 1347. A Genoese merchant vessel made port at Messina, Sicily. What the harbour-master discovered aboard that ship would herald the beginning of Europe's darkest hour. The crew, those who had survived the voyage, bore the unmistakable signs of a disease unlike any seen before. Black lesions covered their bodies. Many were delirious. Others had already succumbed. Local authorities moved quickly to quarantine the vessel, but their efforts came too late. With that ship had arrived not simply a disease, but an invisible force that would claim between 30 and 50% of Europe's population over the next 4 years. What was this pathogen that spread faster than any army? How did it move through a continent with such devastating efficiency? And why did medieval society prove so vulnerable to its advance? To answer these questions, we must first understand the world that existed before the plague arrived, a world that in many ways had been building toward catastrophe for generations. The Europe of the early 14th century was a study in contradictions. Population had been growing steadily since approximately the year 1000 CE. This demographic expansion represented one of the most significant trends of the High Middle Ages. Villages had expanded into towns. Towns had become cities. Urban centers, like Paris, London, and Florence, had populations that would have been unthinkable just 2 centuries earlier. This demographic boom represented, on the surface, a period of prosperity and expansion. Agricultural innovations such as the heavy plow, the 3-field system, and improved harness technology had increased food production. Warmer temperatures during what climatologists now call the medieval warm period had extended growing seasons. Trade networks had expanded, bringing goods from as far as China and the Indies to European markets. However, this growth had occurred without corresponding developments in infrastructure or public health. Medieval urban centers lacked fundamental sanitation systems. There were no sewers in the modern sense, no understanding of disease transmission, and virtually no public health regulations. The very success of medieval expansion had created the conditions for its own catastrophic failure. Contemporary accounts describe cities where waste disposal consisted primarily of throwing refuse directly into the streets. In London, regulations did exist, requiring citizens to keep the fronts of their houses clear, but enforcement was sporadic at best. In Paris, the situation was similar. The Rue de la Huchette, for instance, was described by one 14th-century observer as a place where the filth lies so deep that one cannot pass without wading. When rainfall occurred, these thoroughfares became, quite literally, channels of contamination. Human habitations, livestock, refuse, and human waste occupied the same cramped quarters. In such conditions, infectious disease found an ideal environment for transmission. Rats, in particular, thrived in medieval cities. The black rat, Rattus rattus, had arrived in Europe centuries earlier, probably via grain shipments from the east. By the 14th century, these rodents were ubiquitous in urban environments, living in close proximity to humans in grain stores, homes, and commercial establishments. The density of medieval cities exacerbated these problems. In Florence, for example, population density in some quarters approached levels comparable to modern slums. Buildings were constructed close together, often sharing walls. Streets were narrow, many no more than a few meters wide. Sunlight rarely reached ground level in some neighborhoods. These conditions created environments where disease transmission could occur with devastating efficiency. The agricultural system, upon which this population depended, was equally precarious. Medieval farming relied heavily on subsistence agriculture, with most peasants producing just enough food to feed their families and meet feudal obligations. There were few reserve supplies, and the system had little resilience to weather disruptions. Between 1315 and 1317, a period now known as the Great Famine had already demonstrated this vulnerability. Unseasonable rains destroyed harvests across the continent. The growing season of 1315 was catastrophic. Grain reserves depleted rapidly as successive harvests failed. By 1316, food prices had increased by up to 800% in some markets. Historical records from this period document not only widespread starvation, but in some regions, instances of social breakdown. The Chronicle of Moe Abbey in England records that a dreadful famine prevailed and numberless people died. The Chronicle of Lanercost in Scotland mentions that people ate not only the flesh of horses and dogs, but also that of their own children. While some of these accounts may have been exaggerated, archaeological evidence supports the general picture of severe nutritional stress. Those who survived the famine emerged weakened. Skeletal remains from this period show clear signs of malnutrition, arrested growth lines in bones, dental defects indicating childhood nutritional stress, and reduced average heights compared to previous generations. Chronic malnutrition had compromised immune systems across entire populations. This demographic reality would prove crucial when the plague arrived 3 decades later. A body weakened by years of poor nutrition is far more susceptible to infectious disease. The immune system requires adequate protein and micronutrients to function properly. Medieval European diets, heavily dependent on bread and gruel with little meat or fresh vegetables, often failed to provide these necessities even in good times. In the wake of the Great Famine, much of the population was living in a state of chronic immune compromise. Compounding these challenges, Europe had entered a period of sustained military conflict. In 1337, what would later be termed the 100 Years' War had begun between England and France. This conflict would continue, with interruptions, until 1453, but its early decades coincided almost exactly with the plague's arrival. Military campaigns created additional vectors for disease transmission. Armies in the 14th century were substantial undertakings, sometimes numbering tens of thousands of soldiers, plus associated camp followers, merchants, and support personnel. These mobile populations moved from region to region, accompanied inevitably by supply trains and the rodents that inhabited them. Moreover, warfare created conditions ideal for disease spread. Armies besieging cities often diverted or contaminated water supplies. Military camps, with their concentration of people and livestock, became breeding grounds for disease. Retreating armies sometimes destroyed crops and killed livestock as a scorched earth tactic, creating famine conditions that further weakened civilian populations. The social structure of medieval Europe also played a role. The feudal system, with its hierarchies of obligation and dependence, meant that population movement was controlled but not prevented. Peasants were tied to the land, but merchants, Pilgrims, soldiers, and nobles moved constantly. This created a network of contacts that could spread disease both within and between regions. Trade routes were particularly significant. By the 14th century, Europe was connected to a vast commercial network extending from England to China. The Silk Road brought luxury goods overland from Asia. Maritime routes connected Mediterranean ports with the Black Sea, the Atlantic coast, and beyond. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa maintained trading colonies as far east as the Crimea. These connections brought prosperity, but they also created superhighways for disease transmission. A pathogen emerging in Central Asia could reach London or Paris in a matter of months, carried along by the normal flow of commerce. This is precisely what occurred in 1347. These factors combined to create what epidemiologists today would recognize as ideal conditions for pandemic spread. Dense population centers, compromised public health, weakened immunity, extensive networks of human movement, and intimate contact between humans and disease vectors like rodents. Medieval Europe, in essence, represented a civilization vulnerable to catastrophic disease outbreak. The infrastructure couldn't handle it. The population wasn't healthy enough to resist it, and the social and economic networks existed to spread it. What it required was only an introduction of a sufficiently virulent pathogen. That introduction was about to occur. But to understand how it happened, we need to look east, to the steppes of Central Asia and the complex political and military situation that existed there in the mid-14th century. For decades, historians debated the geographic origins of the Black Death pandemic. Various theories pointed to China, India, or the Central Asian steppes as potential sources. Recent archaeological and genetic evidence has provided greater clarity regarding this question, though mysteries remain. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, appears to have existed in rodent populations across Central Asia for centuries, possibly millennia. Genetic analysis of modern plague strains suggests that the bacterium evolved from a less virulent ancestor sometime between 1,000 and 20,000 years ago. It exists in what epidemiologists call enzootic cycles, circulation among rodent populations with occasional spillover into human hosts. However, something changed in the early to mid-14th century that enabled its transmission to human populations on a catastrophic scale. The precise trigger remains unclear, but climate change may have played a role. The medieval warm period was ending, and cooler, wetter conditions may have altered rodent population dynamics in ways that increased human-rodent contact. The first clearly documented outbreak occurred at Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony located in present-day Crimea, on the northern shore of the Black Sea. In 1346, the city found itself under siege by forces of the Golden Horde, a Mongol military confederation that controlled much of the Eurasian steppe. The Golden Horde's presence in the region was itself a consequence of the Mongol conquests of the previous century. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, Mongol armies had conquered the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from China to Eastern Europe. The Pax Mongolica that followed had facilitated trade and communication across Eurasia, including the routes that would later transmit plague. According to the Chronicle of Gabriele de Mussi, an Italian notary who later recorded these events, the besieging army employed an unusual tactic. They allegedly used catapults to launch the bodies of plague victims over the city walls. De Mussi writes, "The Tartars, fatigued by such a plague and pestiferous disease, stupefied and amazed, observing themselves dying without hope of health, ordered cadavers placed on their hurling machines and thrown into the city of Kaffa, so that by means of these intolerable passengers, the defenders died widely. Whether this account represents literal biological warfare or symbolic narrative remains debated among historians. Some scholars accept it as factual, noting that the concept of contagion, while not scientifically understood, was recognized empirically in the medieval period. Others argue that the account may be exaggerated or metaphorical, and that plague transmission more likely occurred through normal contact with infected rodents and fleas during the siege. What is certain is that plague outbreak occurred within Kaffa during or shortly after this siege. The disease spread through the city with devastating speed. When the siege lifted, the surviving inhabitants faced a terrible dilemma: remain in a plague-stricken city or flee by ship to other Mediterranean ports. Many chose to flee. Genoese merchants, who had established Kaffa as a trading post, began evacuating by ship. These vessels carried not only human passengers, but also cargo, provisions, and inevitably the black rat, Rattus rattus, and the fleas that infested these rodents. Unknown to the fleeing merchants, they had become vectors for one of history's most devastating pandemics. The journey from Kaffa to Messina typically took several weeks. During that time, the plague continued its work aboard ship. Some vessels arrived with most of their crew already dead. Others reached port with enough survivors to dock, but by then, the disease was already spreading among the remaining crew and passengers. Modern understanding of plague transmission reveals the mechanism. Yersinia pestis bacteria, carried by fleas that typically parasitize rodents, can jump to human hosts when rodent populations decline. The bacterium multiplies in the flea's digestive tract, forming a biofilm that blocks the proventriculus, the valve between the esophagus and stomach. This blockage prevents the flea from feeding successfully. Starving and increasingly desperate, the flea bites more frequently and aggressively. Each bite attempt results in regurgitation of bacteria-laden blood back into the wound. This creates an efficient transmission cycle from rat to flea to human. Once established in human hosts, plague can take several forms. Bubonic plague, the most common, results from bacterial multiplication in lymph nodes, creating the characteristic buboes. Septicemic plague occurs when bacteria enter the bloodstream directly. Pneumonic plague develops when the lungs become infected, and this variant can transmit directly between humans through respiratory droplets, requiring no rodent or flea intermediary. The arrival of infected ships at Messina in October 1347 marked the beginning of the European pandemic. Contemporary accounts describe the scene. Michel da Piazza, a Franciscan friar, wrote, "At the beginning of October, in the year of the incarnation of the Son of God, 1347, 12 Genoese galleys entered the harbour of Messina. In their bones, they bore so virulent a disease that anyone who only spoke to them was seized by a mortal illness and in no manner could evade death. The Messina authorities quickly recognized the danger. They ordered the ships to leave, but by then it was too late. The disease had already made landfall. Within days, cases appeared in the city. Within weeks, hundreds were dying. From this Sicilian port, the disease spread with remarkable speed. The Mediterranean world of 1347 was highly interconnected through maritime trade. Ships traveled regularly between Sicily, mainland Italy, southern France, and Spain. Each vessel potentially carried infected rats and fleas. Genoa reported its first cases in January 1348. Venice followed shortly after. Marseille, one of the busiest ports in the western Mediterranean, was affected by February. From these coastal cities, the plague spread inland along river valleys and trade routes. The speed of transmission astonished contemporary observers. The disease covered over 2,500 miles in approximately 5 years, achieving this without benefit of mechanized transportation. A journey from Messina to London that took weeks by ship saw the plague make the same trip in months. This rapid geographic spread suggests multiple transmission routes. Infected cargo on ships certainly played a role. Human movement along trade networks was significant, and in densely populated urban environments, pneumonic plague may have transmitted directly between humans, accelerating local spread even as bubonic plague spread more slowly through rat and flea populations. By June 1348, the plague had reached Paris. King Philip VI fled the city, taking refuge in the countryside. By autumn, it had crossed the English Channel. London was affected by November. From there, it spread north into Scotland and west into Wales and Ireland. The plague's progression wasn't uniform. Some areas were devastated, while neighboring regions were spared. Cities generally suffered worse than rural areas, though no location was immune. Milan uniquely implemented strict quarantine measures that may have reduced its mortality significantly. Authorities there ordered that the first houses showing plague cases be sealed entirely, with the occupants left to die or recover inside. Brutal, but potentially effective. By 1350, the plague had reached Scandinavia, carried by ships trading in wool and fish. By 1351, it had pushed into Russia. By 1353, when the first wave finally exhausted itself, it had touched virtually every corner of Europe, from Sicily to Norway, from Portugal to Poland. But the Black Death wasn't just a European phenomenon. The same plague that devastated Europe also affected the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. Cairo lost perhaps 40% of its population. Damascus was similarly devastated. Contemporary Arab chroniclers describe scenes as horrific as any from Europe. The total mortality is staggering to contemplate. In a pre-plague Europe of perhaps 75 million people, somewhere between 25 and 40 million died. Some regions lost more than half their population. Others, through luck or isolation or effective public health measures, suffered less. But no area escaped entirely. And this was only the beginning. Plague would return in waves throughout the late medieval and early modern period. The second pandemic, as scholars term the period from 1347 to the early 19th century, saw repeated outbreaks. London's Great Plague of 1665, Marseille's outbreak of 1720, each killed thousands. Each reminded survivors that the disease had not disappeared, only retreated. To understand why plague was so devastating, we need to look at its clinical presentation and the medieval understanding, or misunderstanding, of disease. The disease presented in forms that medieval physicians had no framework to understand. Medical education in the 14th century was based primarily on ancient texts, the works of Galen and Hippocrates, along with later Islamic medical writers like Avicenna. These texts described various fevers and epidemics, but nothing that quite matched what physicians were now seeing. The most common variant, bubonic plague, manifested with dramatic and painful symptoms that developed in a characteristic pattern. Initial presentation typically occurred within 2 to 6 days of infection, though this incubation period could be shorter or longer. The first signs were often nonspecific: fever, chills, headache, weakness, and generalized body aches. These symptoms could be mistaken for any number of other illnesses. However, within 24 to 48 hours, the characteristic buboes appeared: swollen, painful lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, or neck. These represented the body's lymphatic system, attempting to contain the bacterial infection. Lymph nodes near the site of the flea bite would swell dramatically, often reaching the size of a chicken egg or even larger. Contemporary medical texts describe these buboes as excruciatingly painful. Patients could barely move the affected limb. The overlying skin would become red, then purple, then black as tissue necrosis set in. In many cases, the buboes would rupture, releasing purulent discharge containing billions of bacteria. The associated odor was reportedly so severe that physicians employed vinegar-soaked sponges or aromatic herbs simply to approach patients. Guy de Chauliac, physician to Pope Clement VI in Avignon, provided one of the most detailed medical descriptions. He distinguished between two types, one characterized by continuous fever and blood spitting, lasting 3 days and inevitably fatal. The other characterized by fever and buboes, lasting 5 days and sometimes survivable. His observations, while couched in humoral terminology, were reasonably accurate. In more severe cases, the infection spread systemically, resulting in septicemic plague. This variant caused tissue necrosis throughout the body, sometimes resulting in the blackening of extremities that gave the pandemic one of its common names. The mortality rate for untreated bubonic plague is estimated at 60 to 70%. For septicemic variants, mortality approached 100%. A third form, pneumonic plague, developed when the bacteria infected lung tissue. This could occur as a complication of bubonic or septicemic plague, or through direct inhalation of bacteria in droplets from another pneumonic plague patient. Symptoms included high fever, chest pain, difficulty breathing, and coughing up blood-tinged sputum containing massive numbers of bacteria. Pneumonic plague was the most rapidly fatal form. Death often occurred within 24 to 48 hours of symptom onset, sometimes even faster. Because it could transmit directly between humans through respiratory droplets, it required no rodent or flea intermediary, potentially allowing for more explosive outbreaks in confined populations. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian writer who witnessed the plague in Florence, provided one of the most detailed contemporary accounts from a lay perspective. In the introduction to his Decameron, he describes victims who appeared healthy at breakfast and were dead by evening. The disease, he noted, spread as fire runs through dry or oily things. Boccaccio also described how the disease could be contracted. Not only did it pass from man to man, but what was far more terrifying was that if an animal other than a human being touched the clothing or other possessions of someone who was sick or had died of the plague, it would be contaminated and would die shortly afterwards. This observation, while attributing too much agency to contaminated objects, wasn't entirely wrong. Fleas could indeed survive in clothing and bedding, maintaining their infectivity. Medieval physicians, operating within the theoretical framework of humoral medicine, had no effective treatments. The humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greece, held that health depended on balance between 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease represented an imbalance that could be corrected by adjusting these humors. For plague, physicians typically recommended bloodletting to reduce excess blood, which was thought to be causing the fever. They might also prescribe purgatives to eliminate corrupt humors through the bowels. Buboes were sometimes lanced to drain pus, a procedure that must have been agonizing and likely introduced secondary infections. Various theriac compounds were recommended. Complex mixtures of dozens of ingredients, sometimes including exotic substances like ground pearls or unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk. The most famous theriac, treacle of Venice, supposedly contained 64 ingredients and required years to prepare properly. It was expensive, elaborate, and completely useless against bacterial infection. The theory of miasmas, corrupt air causing disease, led to other practices. Fires were lit in an attempt to purify the air. Aromatic woods like juniper were burned. Physicians carried sponges soaked in vinegar or wore herb-filled pouches. Some wore the distinctive beaked masks filled with aromatic substances, though these were more common in later outbreaks than in the initial Black Death. Some recommendations showed glimmers of understanding transmission routes, even if the underlying theory was wrong. Authorities in many cities recommended avoiding contact with the sick, fleeing affected areas if possible, and burning the possessions of plague victims. These measures could reduce transmission, though medieval understanding of why they worked was completely incorrect. Quarantine measures also emerged. The word itself derives from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, implemented a 30-day isolation period for arriving ships in 1377, later extended to 40 days. Venice established a plague hospital on an isolated island in 1423. Milan, as mentioned, sealed infected houses entirely. These measures, harsh as they were, represented the first systematic public health responses to epidemic disease in European history. But for individual patients already infected, medieval medicine offered nothing but false hope. Physicians themselves died in large numbers, leading many to flee or refuse to treat plague patients. This abandonment by medical professionals, like that of clergy, contributed to the breakdown of social trust during the crisis. We now know, of course, that bacterial diseases like plague can be treated effectively with antibiotics. Streptomycin, discovered in 1943, was the first effective treatment. Modern antibiotic therapy reduces plague mortality from 60 to 70% to less than 10% for bubonic cases. Even pneumonic plague, almost invariably fatal in the medieval period, has a survival rate of about 50% with prompt treatment. But in 1348, there was no treatment. There was only terror, desperation, and death on a scale that defied comprehension. The plague's impact extended far beyond its immediate mortality. The disease fundamentally disrupted medieval social structures in ways that would have lasting consequences. Fear of contagion overrode traditional family bonds. Contemporary chronicles document instances of parents abandoning children, spouses fleeing from infected partners, and entire households being sealed and left to die. Boccaccio wrote, "This scourge had implanted so great a terror in the hearts of men and women that brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, brother abandoned sister, and very often wives abandoned husbands. Even more extraordinary, fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children, as if they were not their own." This wasn't cruelty in the conventional sense, but rather a desperate survival strategy in the face of a threat no one understood. When death seemed inevitable for those who remained in contact with the sick, self-preservation instinct overrode social bonds. Urban infrastructure collapsed under the strain. In many cities, normal burial practices became impossible due to the sheer number of dead. Churches and their associated graveyards couldn't handle the volume. Mass graves were excavated, sometimes with bodies layered between earth in what amounted to large-scale disposal operations. In Florence, according to local records, the city established multiple emergency burial grounds when existing cemeteries reached capacity. Contemporary accounts describe carts making rounds to collect bodies from houses, like refuse collection. The rituals that normally accompanied death, the vigils, prayers, and processions that gave meaning to loss simply ceased to be possible. In Avignon, where the papal court was located, the situation became so desperate that Pope Clement VI consecrated the Rhone River itself so that bodies could be thrown into it when grave space ran out. This represented an extraordinary departure from normal burial practices, which required interment in consecrated ground. Religious institutions, typically the backbone of medieval social services, found themselves overwhelmed. Many clergy members died while administering sacraments to the sick. The last rites, confession, and extreme unction all required close contact with infected patients. Priests who took their pastoral duties seriously faced enormous risk. Some clergy responded heroically, continuing to minister despite the danger. Others fled, abandoning their flocks. The abandonment was so widespread that it became a source of lasting resentment and contributed to anti-clerical sentiment that would culminate more than a century later in the Protestant Reformation. The shortage of clergy led to irregular arrangements. In some dioceses, lay people were authorized to hear confessions, an extraordinary breach of normal church practice. Some dying individuals, unable to find a priest, confessed their sins to each other or to God directly. These improvisations during crisis would later be cited by reformers as precedents for lay participation in religious life. Economic activity ground to a halt in affected areas. Markets closed. Trade ceased. Harvests went ungathered as entire villages were decimated. In some agricultural regions, fields of grain stood ripe but unharvested because everyone who could have brought in the crop was dead or had fled. The English chronicler Henry Knighton described the situation. There was so great a shortage of laborers and workers of every kind that more than a third of the land in the whole kingdom was let lie idle. So severe was the shortage that no one could be found to labor, even for the highest wages. Some urban centers, like Milan, implemented strict isolation protocols. At the first sign of plague in a house, the building was sealed, doors and windows boarded up, with the inhabitants left inside. Guards were posted to prevent escape. Food might be provided through windows, but no one was allowed out until the disease had run its course. These measures, though severe, may have reduced mortality compared to cities that took no preventive action. Modern epidemiological modeling suggests that aggressive isolation could indeed slow disease spread, even if individual mortality within quarantined houses remained high. Other cities tried different approaches. Some banned public gatherings and processions, though this met resistance from religious authorities who believed that such gatherings were necessary to appease divine wrath. Some closed city gates to travelers from affected areas, though enforcement was difficult. The Hanseatic League, the powerful trading confederation of northern European cities, established a system of health passes. Ships arriving at League ports had to present documentation of where they'd been and whether disease was present there. This represented an early form of epidemiological surveillance, though its effectiveness is unclear. In the absence of effective medical or public health responses, people turned to other solutions. Religious processions and public prayers were common, though these gatherings likely facilitated disease spread. Some communities turned to scapegoating, seeking someone to blame for the catastrophe. In the absence of scientific understanding, populations sought other explanations for the catastrophe unfolding around them. Various theories circulated. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for sin, a belief that accorded with medieval religious worldview and seemed confirmed by the scale of the disaster. Astrological explanations were also popular. The medical faculty of the University of Paris in a report requested by King Philip VI, concluded that the plague was caused by a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius on March 20th, 1345. This conjunction had supposedly corrupted the air, creating pestilential miasmas. Some blamed earthquakes, which were thought to release poisonous vapors from the Earth's interior. There had indeed been significant seismic activity in the years before the plague, including a massive earthquake in the Alps in 1348, which could have seemed like supporting evidence. But one explanation proved particularly deadly: the accusation that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells and water supplies. This accusation was entirely baseless and contradicted by obvious facts, such as that Jews were dying from plague at similar rates to Christians. But in the context of existing anti-Semitic sentiment and mass panic, it gained tragic traction. The idea that Jews were poisoning wells wasn't new. Similar accusations had been made during earlier periods of social stress, but the plague crisis gave these old prejudices new and deadly force. Confessions were sometimes extracted under torture, with victims saying whatever interrogators wanted to hear. These confessions would then be used to justify violence. The violence that followed was systematic and extensive. Between 1348 and 1351, Jewish communities throughout Europe were subjected to organized massacres. The German term pogrom, derived from Russian but applicable here, describes these events: organized mob attacks on minority communities. In Strasbourg, one of the most horrific incidents occurred in February 1349. Approximately 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the city's Jewish quarter, on a specially constructed wooden platform in the Jewish cemetery. The Strasbourg Chronicle notes that many Christians seized the opportunity to cancel debts they owed to Jewish creditors, suggesting economic motivation underlying the religious pretext. Similar violence erupted in Basel, where the Jewish community was herded into a wooden structure and burned. In Erfurt, up to 3,000 Jews were killed. In Mainz, about 6,000 perished. In Brussels, after several Jews were accused of poisoning wells, the entire community of about 600 people was burned. The pogroms spread across the German-speaking lands, through Switzerland, into parts of France and Spain. In some cases, Jewish communities chose mass suicide rather than face mob violence. In others, local authorities tried to protect Jewish residents but were overwhelmed by mobs. Importantly, many of these massacres occurred in cities where the plague had not yet arrived, indicating that fear, rather than actual disease presence, drove the violence. The accused poisoning served as an outlet for anxiety and rage in populations traumatized by plague or anticipating its arrival. Pope Clement VI made several attempts to halt the persecution. In September 1348, and again in October, he issued papal bulls condemning the violence and pointing out the logical absurdities of the accusations. He noted correctly that Jews were dying from plague at similar rates to Christians, which would be unlikely if they were responsible for causing it. The Pope even threatened excommunication for those who killed Jews, and he took some Jewish refugees under papal protection in Avignon. But his interventions had limited effect. Local authorities, often financially indebted to Jewish lenders, sometimes used the crisis as pretext for both violence and debt cancellation. When religious authority conflicted with economic interest and popular rage, economic interest often won. The pogroms of 1348 to 1351 represent one of the most significant episodes of anti-Semitic violence in medieval history, comparable in some ways to later horrors. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed. Survivors fled eastward, particularly to Poland, where King Casimir the Great offered protection. The Jewish demographic center of gravity shifted permanently eastward, with consequences that would echo for centuries. While Jews faced the worst systematic violence, they weren't the only scapegoats. Lepers were accused in some regions. So-called strangers or outsiders faced suspicion. In some cases, beggars and Roma people were blamed. The plague crisis revealed and amplified existing social tensions and prejudices. Another response to the crisis was the movement of the flagellants. These were groups of men, typically, who engaged in public self-mortification as penance, believing that by suffering they could appease divine wrath and end the plague. Flagellant processions had occurred before in medieval Europe, but the plague gave the movement new energy. Groups would travel from town to town, performing public rituals of whipping themselves until they bled, while singing hymns and calling for repentance. The typical ritual lasted 33 days, representing the years of Christ's life. Participants would gather twice daily to perform their flagellation, creating bloody spectacles that attracted large crowds. They wore uniforms, white robes with red crosses. They claimed special spiritual status, sometimes asserting they could forgive sins without need of clergy. Initially, many communities welcomed the flagellants, seeing them as holy men whose suffering might indeed move God to mercy. But the movement soon became problematic. Flagellants operated outside church authority and sometimes preached doctrines that verged on heresy. They claimed their suffering was more efficacious than church sacraments. Worse, flagellant groups often participated in anti-Jewish violence. In some German cities, the arrival of flagellants preceded pogroms. Their rhetoric about divine punishment and the need for purification sometimes identified Jews as obstacles to salvation who needed to be eliminated. By October 1349, Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellant movement. He ordered bishops to suppress it and forbade further processions. Secular authorities also moved against the movement, seeing it as a source of disorder. The flagellants gradually dispersed, though sporadic outbreaks of similar movements would occur in later decades. The flagellant movement, like the anti-Jewish violence, represented an attempt to impose meaning and control on a catastrophe that defied understanding. When the existing social and religious order couldn't explain or prevent the plague, people turned to alternative explanations and extreme measures. When the initial pandemic wave subsided around 1353, Europe had been fundamentally transformed. The demographic catastrophe had profound economic, social, cultural, and religious effects that would shape the remainder of the medieval period and beyond. The most immediate consequence was demographic. While exact mortality figures are impossible to determine, scholarly estimates suggest that Europe lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population. Some regions suffered more than others. Italy, Mediterranean France, and parts of Spain may have lost 50 to 60% of their populations. England probably lost 40 to 50%. Some rural areas were more fortunate, particularly isolated regions with low population density. But these numbers mask local variation. Some villages were completely wiped out, their names surviving only in records. Others escaped relatively lightly. Some cities, like Milan, suffered less than their neighbors due to aggressive public health measures. The overall pattern, though, was catastrophic loss. This demographic collapse had immediate economic effects. Labor shortage became acute almost overnight. With perhaps half the workforce dead, surviving workers found themselves in a stronger negotiating position than ever before in the feudal system. The fundamental economic equation had shifted. Land and capital remained, but labor was suddenly scarce and valuable. Landowners needed workers to bring in harvests, maintain properties, and generate rent income. Workers could demand higher wages and better conditions. Many simply left their ancestral holdings, moving to other estates or to cities where wages were higher and conditions better. This mobility, previously restricted under feudal law, became a practical reality that authorities struggled to prevent. The response from the ruling classes was swift, but ultimately ineffective. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict worker mobility. The ordinance declared, "Every man and woman of our realm of England, of what condition he be, free or bond, able in body, and within the age of 60 years, shall be bound to serve him, which so shall him require, and take only the wages, livery, meed, or salary, which were accustomed to be given in the places where he oweth to serve." Similar legislation appeared throughout Europe. In France, King John II issued ordinances fixing wages and prices. In Spain, Peter IV of Aragon attempted similar controls, but enforcement proved impossible. When every employer desperately needed workers, market forces overwhelmed legal restrictions. Wages rose dramatically despite the laws. Contemporary chronicles complain bitterly about worker demands. The English chronicler Henry Knighton grumbled, "The labourers were so arrogant and hostile that they had no regard for the king's command. But if anyone wished to have them, he had to give them whatever they wanted, and either lose his fruits and crops or satisfy the labourers' greed and arrogance." The result was a gradual erosion of feudal labour relations. Serfdom, the system binding peasants to the land, began to break down. In England, the percentage of the rural population holding free tenure increased substantially in the decades after the plague. By 1400, wage labour had largely replaced labour services in many regions. The rigid feudal hierarchy of lord and serf was giving way to more modern economic relationships based on wages and rents. This transformation wasn't immediate or uniform. Serfdom persisted in many areas, particularly in Eastern Europe, where it would actually intensify. But in Western Europe, the plague marked a clear turning point. Some historians argue that it accelerated the transition from feudalism to more modern economic systems by several generations, compressing social changes that might otherwise have taken centuries. The labor shortage also affected agriculture. Much marginal land, brought under cultivation during the population boom of previous centuries, was abandoned. In England, arable land reverted to pasture, particularly for sheep raising, which required less labor. This shift contributed to the wool industry's growth, but also displaced rural populations, creating new social tensions. Urban areas saw similar changes. Craft guilds, which had restricted entry to protect existing members, found themselves unable to maintain their monopolies when demand for goods and services exceeded available workers. In some cities, restrictions on who could practice certain trades were relaxed. This created opportunities for social advancement that would have been impossible before the plague. Women gained new economic opportunities in this environment. With men dead in large numbers, women took on roles previously closed to them. The records of English manors show women working as agricultural labourers, a rarity before the plague. In cities, widows took over their husbands' businesses with greater frequency. Guild regulations that had restricted female participation sometimes relaxed during the labor shortage. This shouldn't be overstated. Medieval society remained deeply patriarchal, and most gains women made were temporary, reversed, as population recovered in later generations. But the immediate post-plague period did see expanded economic roles for women, at least in some contexts. The economic changes had political consequences. Peasant revolts erupted in various locations, most famously the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. While this uprising had multiple causes, including new poll taxes and lingering resentment from the Hundred Years' War, it reflected the changed power dynamics post-plague. Peasants who had tasted higher wages and greater mobility were unwilling to accept reassertion of feudal controls. The revolt's demands reflected this new consciousness. The rebels wanted abolition of serfdom, reduction of rents, and removal of restrictions on labor mobility. Though the revolt was suppressed and its leaders executed, including the famous Wat Tyler, the underlying economic forces it represented couldn't be reversed by force. Culturally, the plague left a distinctive and lasting mark. Art and literature from the post-plague period reflect an acute awareness of mortality and a sometimes dark preoccupation with death. The motif of the danse macabre, or dance of death, became common. Artistic representations showing skeletons or personified death-leading living figures of all social classes in a procession, emphasizing mortality's universality and inevitability. These dance of death images appeared in churches, manuscripts, and public spaces throughout Europe. The message was egalitarian and unsettling. Death comes for everyone, regardless of wealth, power, or piety. A king and a beggar, a bishop and a peasant, all dance with death on equal terms. This theme resonated in a society that had just witnessed disease killing indiscriminately. Tomb art also changed. Before the plague, tomb sculptures typically showed the deceased in idealized form, healthy, pious, at peace. After the plague, transy tombs became popular. Double-decker monuments showing the deceased both as they were in life above and as a decaying corpse below. These memento mori reminded viewers of death's physical reality and the body's corruption. Literature from the period reflects both trauma and, in some cases, a certain liberation from previous social norms. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of plague in Florence, frames its stories as tales told by young people who have fled the city to escape disease. The stories themselves range from pious to bawdy, but the frame narrative's emphasis on mortality and the precariousness of life pervades the work. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written several decades later, shows continuing influence. The pilgrims travel to Thomas Becket's shrine, itself a journey motivated by concerns about death and salvation. The variety of social classes represented, from knight to miller, reflects the somewhat more fluid post-plague society. The plague also influenced religious sensibility. Many survivors developed more intense personal piety, reflected in the growth of lay religious movements and mysticism. Books of hours, personal prayer books, became more common and elaborate as literacy spread and people sought direct connection with the divine. Simultaneously, the Church's authority had been weakened by the crisis. Many blamed the Church for failing to prevent or explain the plague. The clerical death toll had been high, and the survivors included both heroes who had stayed to minister and survivors who had fled. The memory of clerical abandonment lingered. Heretical movements gained strength in this environment. The Lollards in England, followers of John Wycliffe, called for vernacular Bible translation, criticized clerical wealth, and questioned papal authority. The Hussites in Bohemia, following Jan Hus, advanced similar critiques. While these movements had roots predating the plague, the crisis provided fertile ground for their growth. The plague's effect on the Church would culminate more than 150 years later in the Protestant Reformation. While the Reformation had many causes, the questioning of church authority that intensified after the Black Death was certainly one factor. Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 addressed abuses like indulgent sales, but underlying his critique was a broader challenge to institutional religious authority, a challenge that the plague crisis had made thinkable. The impact on intellectual life was complex. Universities had suffered during the plague. Many scholars died, and recruitment of students temporarily collapsed. But in the aftermath, numerous new universities were founded to train replacement clergy and professionals. This actually expanded access to higher education, as more institutions meant more opportunities for study. Medical thought began to shift, though slowly. The complete failure of humoral theory and traditional treatments to explain or address plague led some practitioners to question inherited wisdom. Empirical observation gained slightly more respect, though it would be centuries before scientific medicine truly emerged. Some scholars point to the plague as contributing to the Renaissance, the cultural and intellectual movement that would transform Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. The argument is that by disrupting the old order, by demonstrating the failure of traditional authorities to manage crisis, and by creating economic conditions that freed resources for cultural production, the plague helped create space for new ways of thinking. This interpretation shouldn't be pushed too far. The Renaissance had many causes, and some regions that weren't heavily affected by plague were among the Renaissance's leaders. But it's plausible that the social and economic disruptions of the mid-14th century contributed to the broader transformation of European culture. The Black Death of 1347 to 1353 wasn't a single event, but the beginning of what historians call the Second Pandemic, a period of recurring plague outbreaks lasting into the early 19th century. Plague would return to Europe in waves, roughly every decade initially, then with decreasing frequency over the following centuries. These subsequent outbreaks were typically less devastating than the initial pandemic, partly because the most vulnerable individuals had already died, leaving a somewhat more resistant population. But they were still major mortality events that shaped European demography and society for generations. In England, significant plague years included 1361 to 1362, 1369, 1374 to 1375, 1390 and 1405. The outbreak of 1361 to 1362, sometimes called the mortality of children, was particularly noted for affecting young people who had been born after the initial pandemic and thus had no acquired immunity. Continental Europe saw similar patterns. Paris suffered major outbreaks in 1360 to 1361, 1363, 1374 to 1375, and repeatedly through the 15th century. Italy experienced recurring plague throughout the period, with notable outbreaks in 1361, 1371, and 1373. Some of these later outbreaks are well documented. London's Great Plague of 1665 to 1666 killed perhaps 100,000 people, about a quarter of the city's population. Daniel Defoe's fictionalized account, A Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722 but set in 1665, provides vivid descriptions of plague's impact on the city. The 1665 outbreak showed both continuity and change from earlier plague events. The disease mechanism was the same, and medical understanding remained limited, but public health responses had become more sophisticated. plague orders were issued detailing quarantine procedures. Houses with plague cases were marked with red crosses and sealed for 40 days. Street cleaning was ordered. Burials were regulated. These measures probably had limited effect on mortality, but they represent growing governmental involvement in public health, a development that would eventually lead to modern public health institutions. The Marseille Plague of 1720 to 1722 was one of the last major outbreaks in Western Europe. It began when the ship Grand Saint-Antoine arrived from the Levant with infected cargo. Despite quarantine regulations, disease spread into the city, killing perhaps 100,000 people in Marseille and surrounding regions. This outbreak is particularly well documented, with detailed records of mortality, public health measures, and social responses. The French government implemented military cordons to prevent spread beyond Provence, probably the first large-scale use of military quarantine in Europe. These measures were brutal, but may have prevented wider spread. Why did plague eventually disappear from Europe? The answer isn't entirely clear. Improved public health measures played a role, though their effectiveness in controlling plague is debatable. Changes in housing construction, particularly the replacement of thatched roofs with tile or slate, may have reduced rat populations in human habitations. The replacement of Rattus rattus, the black rat, with Rattus norvegicus, the brown rat, has been suggested as a factor. Brown rats are less likely to live in close proximity to humans and are perhaps less efficient plague vectors. However, this theory is controversial, and the timeline doesn't match perfectly across all regions. Climate change may also have played a role. The Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures lasting from about 1350 to 1850, may have altered rodent population dynamics in ways that reduced plague transmission. Colder winters might have created harsher conditions for flea survival. Likely, multiple factors combined to end plague's regular recurrence in Europe. Better housing, improved hygiene, some degree of population immunity, rodent species change, and climate factors may all have contributed. Whatever the cause, by the late 18th century, plague had ceased to be a regular threat in Western Europe, though it continued in other parts of the world. Scientific understanding of the Black Death came remarkably late, considering the disease's historical impact. Only in the late 19th century did researchers identify the causative agent and transmission mechanism. The breakthrough came during an outbreak in Hong Kong in 1894. Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss physician working for the Pasteur Institute, was part of an international team investigating the epidemic. On June 20, 1894, Yersin isolated the bacterium responsible from the buboes of plague victims. The organism was initially named Pasteurella pestis, later renamed Yersinia pestis in his honor. Simultaneously, Japanese bacteriologist Kitasato Shibasaburo made a similar discovery, leading to a brief priority dispute. Modern consensus credits both researchers, though Yersin's work was more thorough and accurate. The transmission mechanism through rats and fleas was elucidated shortly after, during plague outbreaks in India in the early 20th century. Paul-Louis Simon, another Pasteur Institute researcher, demonstrated in 1898 that fleas were the vector. His work showed how rat epizootics, epidemics among rats, preceded human outbreaks, and how human cases increased when rat populations crashed, forcing infected fleas to seek alternative hosts. This discovery finally explained medieval observations about plague's connection to dying rats. Contemporary accounts from the Black Death sometimes mention rodent mortality preceding human cases, but lacking knowledge of disease vectors, observers couldn't understand the significance. Genetic analysis has provided even more detailed understanding. In 2011, a team led by Johannes Krauss successfully sequenced the complete genome of Yersinia pestis from remains in London's East Smithfield Plague Cemetery. This definitively confirmed that medieval Black Death was caused by the same bacterium responsible for modern plague cases. The genetic work also revealed that the medieval strain was ancestral to all modern Yersinia pestis strains, confirming that the second pandemic originated from a single introduction of the bacterium into Europe, probably via the route from Central Asia through Kaffa. In 2022, further research identified even earlier plague victims in present-day Kyrgyzstan, dated to 1338 to 1339. Genetic analysis showed these individuals died from Yersinia pestis, closely related to the strain that later spread to Europe. Cemetery inscriptions from the site mention a pestilence, providing historical confirmation. This finding pushes the pandemic's origin back by nearly a decade and confirms Central Asian origins. It also demonstrates that the bacterium was circulating in human populations for several years before reaching Europe, though we don't know how many people died in this earlier, less documented phase. Modern understanding reveals Yersinia pestis as a remarkably successful pathogen from an evolutionary perspective. The bacterium has adapted to survive in multiple hosts and environments. It can persist in rodent populations indefinitely as an enzootic infection, occasionally spilling over into human populations. The bacterium's life cycle is complex. In fleas, it multiplies in the gut, eventually blocking the proventriculus and causing regurgitation during feeding attempts. In mammalian hosts, it employs numerous virulence factors to evade immune responses. A capsule that prevents phagocytosis, toxins that kill immune cells, and mechanisms to survive inside macrophages. Yersinia pestis evolved from the less virulent Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, probably within the last 20,000 years, though possibly more recently. The key genetic changes included acquisition of genes enabling flea colonization and enhanced virulence in mammals. These changes transformed a relatively harmless gut bacterium into one of history's most devastating pathogens. Plague remains endemic in certain regions today, a fact often surprising to those who think of it as a purely historical disease. The World Health Organization reports between 1,000 and 3,000 cases annually worldwide, with actual numbers possibly higher due to underreporting. Madagascar is currently the most affected country, accounting for the majority of reported cases. The island nation experiences regular outbreaks, including a significant one in 2017, with over 2,400 cases and more than 200 deaths. The outbreak included numerous pneumonic plague cases, raising concerns about potential epidemic spread. The Democratic Republic of Congo reports the second highest number of cases, with plague endemic in several provinces. Peru also sees regular cases, particularly in rural Andean regions. Smaller numbers of cases occur in various other countries, including the United States. In the United States, between 1 and 17 cases are reported annually, primarily in rural areas of the Southwest. New Mexico, Arizona, Northern California, Southern Colorado, and Western Nevada. The bacterium persists in populations of prairie dogs, ground squirrels, and other rodents in these regions. American cases typically occur when humans come into contact with infected rodents or their fleas, often while hiking, camping, or living in rural areas. Domestic cats can also serve as a source, either by bringing infected fleas into homes or, in rare cases, transmitting pneumonic plague directly if they develop lung infection. The crucial difference between historical and modern plague is treatment. Antibiotics are highly effective if administered promptly. Streptomycin, gentamicin, doxycycline, and ciprofloxacin all show efficacy against Yersinia pestis. With appropriate antibiotic therapy, mortality from bubonic plague drops from approximately 60% to less than 10%. Even pneumonic plague, almost invariably fatal in the Middle Ages, has about a 50% survival rate with prompt treatment, and much higher if caught very early. The key is rapid diagnosis and immediate antibiotic administration, preferably within 24 hours of symptom onset. Modern public health surveillance also makes a difference. When cases are identified, contacts can be traced, prophylactic antibiotics can be administered to those exposed, and public health measures can be implemented to prevent further spread. This capacity for rapid response makes pandemic plague unlikely in the modern world, though localized outbreaks remain possible. However, antibiotic resistance is a concern. While most Yersinia pestis strains remain susceptible to standard antibiotics, resistant strains have been identified in Madagascar and elsewhere. The possibility of fully antibiotic-resistant plague is a nightmare scenario that public health officials monitor carefully. Research continues on plague vaccines. Several have been developed, but none is ideal. The original killed whole cell vaccine, used extensively in the mid-20th century, provided limited protection and had significant side effects. Modern approaches focus on subunit vaccines targeting specific bacterial proteins, but none has yet achieved widespread use. For most people in developed countries, plague remains primarily a historical curiosity rather than a personal threat. But for those living in endemic areas, particularly in developing countries with limited public health infrastructure, it remains a real danger. And the potential for plague to emerge in new areas through climate change, ecological disruption, or other factors means that surveillance must continue. The Black Death, then, isn't purely historical. The same bacterium that devastated medieval Europe still exists, still kills, still has pandemic potential if conditions align. Our safety comes not from the disease's disappearance, but from scientific understanding, antibiotic therapy, and public health infrastructure. These are recent developments, fragile protections that require constant maintenance. The Black Death represents more than historical tragedy. It stands as perhaps the clearest case study in how infectious disease can reshape civilization. A pandemic emerging from Central Asian rodent populations, transmitted through commercial networks, found a European society uniquely vulnerable to its effects through a combination of demographic, environmental, and social factors. The result was demographic catastrophe of a scale rarely seen in human history, along with transformations that would reshape European society for centuries. The demographic impact alone staggers comprehension. Between 25 and 40 million deaths in a European population of about 75 million. Proportionally, this exceeds the mortality of the two world wars combined. Some regions lost more than half their populations. Entire villages disappeared. Cities that had been major urban centers were reduced to shadows of their former selves. But the plague's impact extended far beyond body counts. The feudal system, already under strain, accelerated its decline. The relationship between lord and peasant, the fundamental social structure of medieval Europe, was irreversibly altered. Labor became valuable, land less so. Mobility increased, restrictions weakened, and a system that had persisted for centuries began its slow collapse. The Church's authority received a blow from which it never fully recovered. The failure of prayers and intercession to stop the plague, the abandonment by many clergy, and the rise of lay religious movements all contributed to weakening an institution that had been medieval Europe's most powerful. The seeds of the Reformation were planted in the plague pits of 1348. Art and thought began to shift toward more humanistic perspectives. The preoccupation with death, visible in post-plague art, gradually evolved into Renaissance humanism's celebration of human potential. The dance of death gave way, eventually, to David's sculpture and Leonardo's drawings. Medicine, having failed so completely, began the slow process of empirical investigation that would eventually lead to modern scientific understanding. It would take centuries, but the plague's demonstration that traditional medical theory was useless planted seeds of doubt in inherited wisdom. The economic consequences were equally profound. Labor shortage drove wage increases and created opportunities for social mobility. The rigid hierarchies of medieval society became more fluid. A middle class with economic power, independent of land ownership, began to emerge. These changes laid groundwork for the commercial revolution of the early modern period. Perhaps most significantly, the Black Death demonstrated the fragility of human society in the face of microbial threat. Medieval Europe, for all its achievements in art, architecture, theology, and law, was helpless before a bacterium. No amount of prayer, no social hierarchy, no military power could stop it. Only when humans developed scientific understanding of disease and tools to combat it did this vulnerability decrease. This lesson remained relevant through subsequent pandemic events. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide, more than died in World War I. HIV/AIDS has claimed over 35 million lives since its identification in 1981. And most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated that even advanced technological societies remain vulnerable to novel pathogens. Each of these modern pandemics differs from the Black Death in important ways. Influenza is viral rather than bacterial. HIV transmits differently than plague and was eventually controllable through antiretroviral therapy. COVID-19, while devastating, has been far less lethal than plague, with mortality rates measured in single-digit percentages rather than 60%. But fundamental similarities persist. Each pandemic spread through networks of human contact and commerce. Each overwhelmed existing health systems. Each produced social disruption, economic crisis, and political strain. Each revealed how interconnected modern society, like medieval trade networks, creates vulnerabilities alongside benefits. The bacterium that caused the medieval catastrophe still exists. It still occasionally infects humans. Under the right conditions, it could still cause epidemic or pandemic disease. Our safety comes not from the disease's disappearance, but from scientific understanding, antibiotic therapy, and public health infrastructure. These protections are recent and relatively fragile. Antibiotics have existed for less than a century. Modern public health systems are younger still. Both require active maintenance, funding, and expertise to function. And both can fail if stressed sufficiently. As COVID-19 demonstrated when health systems in even wealthy countries were overwhelmed. The question isn't whether another pandemic will occur. It's whether we'll be prepared when it does. Whether we'll maintain the public health infrastructure and scientific capacity needed to respond. Whether we'll heed warnings and act before crisis becomes catastrophe. Whether we'll remember the lessons that the Black Death, at such terrible cost, taught our ancestors. Those lessons are clear. Infectious disease respects no borders, no hierarchies, no authorities, except the biological realities of transmission and immunity. Prevention is far easier than cure. Public health measures that seem excessive before a crisis prove inadequate during it, and societies that fail to maintain their defenses against pandemic disease do so at their peril. The ghosts of 1348 still have something to teach us. The mass graves of London, the sealed houses of Milan, the empty villages of rural Europe. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings, reminders of what happens when microbial threats meet vulnerable populations. Evidence that civilization, for all its achievements, remains fragile in the face of pandemic disease. We now possess tools that medieval Europeans lacked. We understand disease transmission. We have antibiotics, vaccines, and public health systems. We have global surveillance networks and rapid response capabilities. These advantages are enormous, but they're not guarantees. They're tools that require resources, expertise, and political will to deploy effectively. The Black Death killed between a third and half of Europe's population. It took generations for population to recover and centuries for some regions to reach pre-plague levels. The social, economic, and cultural transformations it triggered reshaped European civilization. No comparable event has occurred in the modern era, though whether this reflects our greater capability or merely good fortune remains unclear. What is clear is that the possibility persists. The microbial world hasn't become less dangerous. If anything, antibiotic resistance, climate change, ecological disruption, and increasing global connectivity create new vulnerabilities even as we address old ones. The next pandemic, when it comes, may look nothing like the Black Death, but it will test our defenses and reveal our vulnerabilities just as surely. Perhaps the ultimate lesson is humility. Medieval Europeans believed themselves masters of creation, placed by God at the center of the universe. The plague demonstrated how little control they actually had. Modern societies, for all our scientific and technological achievements, should remember that lesson. We're not as safe as we think. Our defenses aren't as strong as we'd like. And the microbial world, vast and ever-evolving, doesn't care about our theories, our technologies, or our confidence. The plague finally ended, not because humans defeated it, but because circumstances changed. Ecology, climate, immunity, or simple chance. If those circumstances change again, if the balance tips, disease can return. And when it does, our survival will depend on remembering what history teaches and maintaining the defenses we've built at such cost. The Black Death was a catastrophe that killed millions and transformed civilization. But it was also a teacher, if we're willing to learn. The question is whether we'll remember the lesson before we're forced to relearn it the hard way. If you found this investigation into one of history's most devastating pandemics valuable, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. We produce documentary-style content exploring the events, mysteries, and forces that have shaped human civilization. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss future investigations. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of the Black Death do you find most significant? The demographic impact, the social transformations, the failure of medieval institutions, the long-term consequences. I read every comment, and these discussions add valuable perspectives. And if this hour-long exploration provided insight or understanding, consider supporting this work with a like. It genuinely helps this content reach others who share your curiosity about history and its lessons for the present. Until next time, remember that studying the past isn't simply academic exercise. It's preparation for the future we're building. The ghosts of 1348 still have wisdom to offer if we're willing to listen.